Thank you. Good evening, everyone, and welcome to our July Jumpstart Wilmington Kickstart Session. And I believe I know most of you. I think I see one or two new faces. So I'm Deanna Sargent. I'm the Vice President of Community Development at Cinnaire, and we appreciate you joining us this evening. As a friendly reminder, as I'm sure you all hear this all the time in the Zoom world, please make sure to mute your phone or listening device unless speaking. Next slide. So for those of you who may not be familiar with the Jumpstart Wilmington program, it's modeled after the Jumpstart Germantown program, which launched in Philadelphia about 6 years ago. And Wilmington is the first city to launch a Jumpstart program outside of Philadelphia. The purpose of the program is to promote the growth of local developer capacity through training and development to support the neighborhood revitalization and community development solutions by providing aspiring developers with the skills, knowledge, and support they need to rehabilitate properties. Jumpstart Wilmington was launched by Cinnaire to increase local developer capacity in Wilmington and stimulate neighborhood revitalization in Wilmington communities. The program consists of three main components, which are 12 to 15 hours of development training, which many of you are going through or have already gone through, mentoring, and networking. Those interested in participating in the program can visit our website at www.jumpstartwilmington.org to learn more about how to apply. A complementary component of Jumpstart Wilmington is our Kickstart Sessions, which focus on specific development topics and will be open to the broader development community. We would also like to acknowledge the Biden School of Public Policy and Administration's Center for Community Research and Service, who assists with program administration. I'd now like to introduce our speaker of the evening, Bill Larson. Bill Larson is a native Delawarean with deep ties throughout the state and a well-rounded litigator and trial attorney with extensive experience in national asbestos litigation and Delaware corporate and commercial litigation, as well as local government matters. You can read his full bio for more about his legal experience. He also served the City of Wilmington as the Senior Assistant City Solicitor and Special Deputy Attorney General. His duties for the city included litigating cases, drafting legislation, negotiating settlements and property transactions, and advising Mayor Mike Przicki and city department heads, among other responsibilities. He also served as chairman of the city's Zoning Board of Adjustment, a quasi-judicial body that issues rulings on land use matters, and will share his knowledge and experience in this role today during his presentation. Before I turn it over to Bill, I'd like to make a couple of notes. Bill will take questions throughout his presentation, so please enter your questions in the chat, and our chat monitor, Ali Foster, will present your question to Bill, or feel free to unmute yourself and ask your question. And now I'd like to turn it over to Bill.
Thanks, Deanna, and I'm glad to be here. Good to see a nice turnout, and I'm excited to be a part of this program. When I was with the city, I did a lot of work on different development projects, both downtown and in the neighborhoods. And so it's exciting to see more people interested in developing the neighborhoods, and people, taking the time to get knowledge and to get more information so that they can do it right. I love Wilmington. I live in Wilmington. I've been here since I got out of law school, and I don't plan to ever leave Wilmington. One thing I do need to just make sure we sort of put out at the forefront here is I'm going to give an overview of different things related to the Zoning Board of Adjustment and some of the legal standards that the board typically applies. But I'm not giving any legal advice today. I'm speaking generally about what the law is and how the board operates. Since we don't have an attorney-client relationship, I can't get into specific questions. You know, if you asked about, I've got this property and I'm thinking about doing this, what advice do you have for me? I can't get into that, but in this type of setting. But more generally, I'm looking forward to talking about how the board operates. And to do that, I want to provide a little kind of general background about the zoning code so that we all have the same baseline. I know that Jumpstart talks about this some, and some of you may have already received this through Jumpstart, and some of you haven't gone through Jumpstart yet. So you may get this again later, but I think it'll be good to have a similar starting point for everybody. So Wilmington has a zoning code. It's chapter 48 of the city code, and it is available online. There's a system called Muni Code, which has various cities' codes, and Wilmington is a part of that. And it's actually pretty user-friendly. You can just go to the link that we have here, or just Google Muni Code or City of Wilmington, Delaware code, and it'll come up, and you go to chapter 48, and that's the zoning code, the whole thing. Now, in general, the point of the zoning code is so that we don't look like a town like Houston, so that we actually have some organization to our development, and we're just not sprawled out endlessly with, houses next to, downtown type buildings. So the zoning code tries to keep sort of similar uses in similar areas, and help regulate what types of uses are in different areas. It also provides a lot of provisions about how property can be used, things like setbacks, how far a house needs to be from the road, or how far the end of the structure needs to be from the side lot line, so that there's some space, between single family houses. Obviously, in a row house, that would be different. And so you see those types of provisions throughout the code. The code is generally split into three types of zoning areas. There are residential areas. So those are usually referred to as R1, R2, R3, commercial districts, C1, C2, C3, and waterfront districts. Residential districts are what you'd expect. They're mostly residences. There's a few different types of residential districts, some more focused on single family housing, some where you have more duplexes and row homes. R3, which allows for row homes or semi-detached homes, is the most common zoning district throughout the city. And then in commercial districts, you've got different types of commercial uses allowed in different districts. So when you think of commercial districts, you can think of kind of running down Pennsylvania Avenue, where you have a lot of businesses right along Pennsylvania Avenue. And then as you move, basically north and south away from Pennsylvania Avenue, you tend to get into more residential districts. And we also have waterfront districts, which were created back when they really started redeveloping the waterfront, the Christina waterfront. And most of the waterfront districts are down along the Christina, although there are some waterfront districts along the Brandywine, pretty much kind of east of the Market Street Bridge along the Brandywine. And the waterfront has different, no, that's fine, Jan, or whoever's working the slides. Waterfront has different specific provisions that help protect development there and protect the water. Here's a copy of the city zoning map. There's a link at the top that you could go to pull it up. And again, if you just Google City of Wilmington, Delaware zoning map, you'll be able to pop it up, and you can actually kind of go through and look at it. And this gives you a sense of what's out there. The green is parkland, And it's hard to see. There we go. If you zoom in, you can kind of see the green it's actually O, so that's for open space, but generally speaking, that's parkland. If you look at looking at the top left of the map, you'll see R1 districts, which would you can kind of see the Highlands. You can see Wawasset Park, generally more single family homes, R1. If you kind of look at the bottom, sort of the bottom side there, you can see the riverfront along the Christina River. So it just gives you a sense of what's out there in terms of zoning for the city. And it's important to, as we get into this, to know what zoning you have. And one caveat I guess just one thing to mention is you really want to make sure you know what zoning your property is in. And I would not rely on the Newcastle County records, Newcastle County parcel search. I've seen mistakes in that. You want to look at the city zoning map. You want to look at how the city has it listed, potentially, if there's any doubt, confirm with the Department of License and Inspections. You want to make sure you know what zone you're in early in the development process or before you even obtain the property. So now turning more into how the zoning Board of Adjustment works, or the ZBA, as it's usually referred to. It has its own set of procedures. You can see a link here. The City of Wilmington webpage has a page for the Zoning Board of Adjustment, and one of the links on it is the rules of procedure for the board. Those were updated when I was chair of the board about 4 years ago now. And they really lay out the process for hearings and applications. And I would highly recommend reviewing those before you get into the application process, so you understand how everything works. Giving you a little broader overview, how do we get to the board? Well, usually you want to do something, or a developer wants to do something, property owner wants to do something that either isn't permitted by the zoning code or is only permitted with approval of the zoning, the ZBA. Jim DePinto is the city zoning manager. He works in the Department of License and Inspections. He can kind of be seen as the guy that says no, and this guy that is challenging to work with. I would want to totally dispense that idea. Jim is more knowledgeable than anybody in the city about the zoning code. He knows it cold. He's been there for decades, and he can actually be a resource at the hearings. He represents kind of the position of the city in terms of this is what the zoning code says. But he generally doesn't take positions, for or against projects. He's sort of just the facts man in terms of giving information to the board. And so he's somebody who it's good to communicate with in advance of the hearing, to make sure you understand all the underlying facts. The board is made up of 3 members. The City of Wilmington board is actually different than most of the other ZBAs around the state. The state code allows for kind of 2 formations of the board. Most localities use a setup that has 5 appointed members who are members of the public. The City of Wilmington still uses kind of the original version of ZBAs. And so it has 3 members. One is the mayor or his appointee, one is the city solicitor or his appointee, and one is the director or commissioner of public works or her appointee. So currently, the board is Bob Goff, who is the city solicitor. He doesn't have a designee. He typically chairs the board and is a member. He's been with the city about 2.5 years now. Has a long distinguished career, mostly in criminal law, working for the public defender's office, but he also worked for Newcastle County and the Attorney General's office at different points in his career. Brian Mitchell is the appointee for the Department of Public Works, and his day job is really in traffic. So he works on, he doesn't personally work on them, but on traffic patterns, traffic lights. And so he's got great familiarity with, things like parking and traffic flow. And then Tom Ford is the mayor's appointee. In his day job, he is in the Department of Real Estate and Housing. And Tom's role is he's sort of the property manager for the city, for city-owned properties, and he does a lot of work with on some development projects and with the land bank. Both Tom and Brian have been on the board for several years. So talking a little bit about the process, and we'll get into a little bit more detail, but the board acts through public hearings, public meetings, and the applicant comes in and essentially presents their case. It's a little bit different than a jury trial, because it's an administrative hearing. So an applicant comes in, they can be represented by a lawyer. Frequently, they might have an architect involved. Sometimes a real estate agent is involved. And they can call witnesses. It's a little more informal than a hearing. So you sometimes if a lawyer's involved, they might actually call somebody as a witness and do kind of a Q&A with them. But often the lawyer or whoever's presenting basically just makes a series of statements and kind of explains things to the board. They might bring somebody else to also make a statement and further explain things. Members of the public also have an opportunity to be heard. And one thing that I wanted to flag for everybody, because every once in a while somebody misses it and it can create a problem, is when the board does approve things, that approval is essentially only good for a year. So you need to apply for permits within a year of the board's decision, or else the board's decision kind of becomes null and void. And so you don't want to go through the process again if you got your project approved. We could go to the next slide.
Bill, before you start
Yes.
on this next slide, there is a question in the chat.
Okay.
You spoke about not relying on the Newcastle County zoning maps. Are the Wilmington zoning maps going to be shared with Newcastle County?
Well, what I was saying was I wouldn't rely on parcel search, parcel view, which is something that Newcastle County puts out. It's really a great tool and can be really helpful. But I've just seen it contains a bunch of information about properties. And one of the things is it lists the zoning classification. And I've just seen errors. It's not an issue of like the city zoning map being a secret from Newcastle County. It's, I assume, just some sort of input error along the way. So Newcastle County Parcels View is a really useful tool. But when trying to figure out a city zoning classification, I would look at the publicly available city map and then follow up with the city if there's any doubt. So moving on to the application, the city zoning board application is available online. It's at the zoning board's webpage. And we redesigned it a few years ago to try to make it as user-friendly as possible. And it contains several parts. I was actually just, if you saw me looking around, grabbing it. So there is somewhere where you've got to certify that essentially the property is up to date in terms of debts owed to the city. So it's current on property taxes, water, sewer, stormwater, that type of thing. And the city will check that. And if you owe money to the city, you're not going to be able to proceed with the application. Then you provide some information about the legal owner of the property, the applicant. Sometimes that's the same person, but it's not always. Frequently before, there might be a contract to sell property that's contingent on zoning board approval for something. And so the buyer would be the applicant. They want to get approval, but they wouldn't yet be the legal owner of the property. And then you also provide some information about the property. And then there's a section where you describe essentially what it is that you're looking for from the board and why you think you should get it. And through this process, there are requirements for adjoining property owners to be notified, public officials like the city council, district council member for that property. Usually the state senator, state rep also have to be notified, neighborhood association. So this doesn't happen in secret. The people who have the most direct interest in terms of adjoining property owners, people around the property, neighborhood association, elected officials are all provided notice of the hearing and what's going on. And in the application, one of the things you have to note is if you know of any opposition, if you went and talked to your neighbor and said, hey, I want to do this, and they said, no, I'm against that, you've got to disclose that information to the board. Doesn't mean you won't get it approved, but you do have to disclose that information to the board. And the application, supporting documentation, all that information is due to the board a week before the hearing. All right, let's go to the next slide. So we're going to talk about some of the specific issues that you would likely go to the board for and what some of the most common ones are. Probably the most common request is for an area variance, and that's relief from the property requirements. Typically, these are restrictions on how, not so much on the use of the property, but really for the structure on the property. So this is the setbacks from the front, from the back of the lot lines. This is side setbacks from houses on the side lot lines. This comes up frequently when residents are trying to build a deck on the back of their house. Because frankly, what happens a lot is a lot of the properties in the city of Wilmington predate the zoning code. And so you may have a side setback of 6 feet that's required, but your house is only 2 feet off the side setback. Now, if your house was built in 1920 and it predates the zoning code, that's fine. That's not a problem that your house is in violation because the zoning code came later. And so it's essentially grandfathered in. Where it comes up, though, is when somebody wants to make a change to the existing structure. So when somebody wants to add a sunroom on the back of their house, or wants to extend the second floor over the kitchen to get a little extra bedroom, or when somebody wants to put a deck in, because if you which makes sense, right? If you want to put it in so that it stays in line with the rest of the house, if you're putting that second floor addition in over the kitchen, you don't want it to be 4 feet less wide than the rest of the house. You want it to be in line with the rest of the house. But because it's a new structure that you're pulling permits for, it's going to kind of trip the zoning code restriction on the side setback. So that's frequently not a big deal in terms of getting approval, but it's that Jim DePinto, who's getting the permit, he's going to flag it because it doesn't follow the zoning code. So as I mentioned, he's not necessarily against you doing it. It's just his job to flag it. And so it goes up, and then, you bring a request to the zoning board. And so there's a test that the zoning board applies in these situations for area variance. And it's a balancing test. So a balancing test doesn't mean that you have to meet every single one of the requirements. It means that the board has to consider these things. And then the board kind of has some discretion to weigh those things, and whichever side they think has the greater weight of the evidence, or kind of the better argument, that's the way they will typically come out. So the board looks at 4 factors in this exceptional practical difficulties test, which is also referred to as the quick check test or factors, after an old Supreme Court case that had quick check in the name. So you look at, or the board looks at, the nature of the zone where the property lies and the character of the properties in the immediate vicinity. I kind of consider those to be pretty similar. And so the board's looking at, well, what else is in that area? What else is on that block? Does everybody have a deck on the back of their house, or do other people have a deck on the back of their house that has the same, violation of the side set off? Then, that kind of favors approving. If you're trying to do something that nobody else on the block has, or nobody else in the area has, then that would tend to weigh against approving the request. The board also looks at whether removal of the restriction on the applicant's property would seriously affect the neighboring property and its uses. So the idea here is that we don't want people doing things on their property that are going to have a negative impact on their neighbor's property. And so, if there's an alleyway, between the 2 properties, well, we might not want somebody to build into the alleyway, and now you can't get between the properties, and that impacts the neighbor's ability to use their property. And then the board also looks at whether failure to remove the restriction would create an unnecessary hardship or exceptional practical difficulty for the owner. And so this can come into play in lots of different ways, but this is kind of the opportunity for the why you should give it to me. Why do I need it? Why would it be unfair if you didn't approve it? And it talks about necessary and sort of normal improvements to the property, like a deck. That's common. To have a deck or a porch in our city, and also actually it can come up when, depending on the extent of them, repairs, or maybe like a little extension on a porch or a deck. And so, if there are normal improvements that somebody would make in the course of owning property, that's going to favor approval. Okay, let's go to the next slide. So use variances. These have to do with how a property may be used. I mentioned earlier, residential or commercial areas. The zoning code defines several different types of property or uses for property. And, it can be apartment houses, it can be single family homes, it can be odd things like a composting and recycling facility, or a school, or a church. And so the different zones allow for different uses. And this is a harder test. So if you want to use a property for a purpose that is not already allowed under the zoning code, then you've got to go to the zoning board and get approval and meet this unnecessary hardship test. Where I mentioned the last test was had some discretion for the board, and they got to weigh all the factors. This is a different type of standard or test. Here, you got to get a check next to each one. You got to essentially prove each one of these factors to the board in order to get approval. So, and it's a hard test, frankly, to meet. These types of requests are often denied. So the first factor that the board looks at is the property cannot yield a reasonable return when used for permitted use. And so this can come up, when a property has been used for something over the years, and it's not a permitted use, but it's lost its non-conforming status, which we'll get into in a minute. But essentially means it's lost its grandfathered status. But you have a property that has only ever been a corner store, and it's been vacant for a few years, and somebody wants to come along and turn it into some sort of commercial use, but commercial use isn't allowed. Then the next factor is the need for the variance is due to unique circumstances and not a general sort of condition of the neighborhood. So that's sort of what I was just talking about. There's something unique about the property, how the property's been used or developed over the years, that makes this variance needed. Next, the board looks at whether the proposed use will alter the essential character of the locality, the neighborhood. So often looking at, if similar uses are already in the neighborhood or the area. It could mean, down the block or around the corner. And sometimes the zoning districts are different down the block or around the corner. But the board looks at that, and then the board looks at whether all of the permitted uses of the property are economically unfeasible. And so this usually requires some evidence to show that the various permitted uses are not economically feasible, will not work for that property. And then the zoning code also, both for this type of variance and the previous variance, has an additional requirement. The city zoning code has additional requirement where it essentially has to kind of be not detrimental to the health and welfare of the neighborhood. So one of my favorite projects that came up before the board, I didn't know anything about it at the time, but in hindsight, it's kind of a favorite, is Torbert Social. So back in, I think it was 2017, the owners of Big Fish came before the board and wanted to develop what is now Torbert Social on Torbert Street behind Washington Street Ale House. And for some reason that I, to this day, don't understand, that property was in an R3 zoning district. I frankly think that the line in the zoning map was just sort of a mistake, that it was on the wrong side of the property, because everything to the west and south of the property are commercial properties, and commercial zoning would make way more sense for that property because it had never been a residential property. It had been a bunch of different things, a tannery, and other commercial uses, but nothing. It had never been residential. But it turned out it was in an R3 zoning district, and we got essentially a close up of the map, and it was on the wrong side of the line. It was in the R3, with the rest of the residences in maybe Midtown Brandywine. And this property had been vacant for 30 years. The owners had gone to the Design and Review Commission to get approval for a partial demo, because the building was literally caving in. And so, it had been vacant for 30 years, and all the issues that can happen with vacant properties were happening there. And so this group came along and said, we're going to turn this into a really neat sort of speakeasy, what's now Torbert Social, and they came looking for approval. And it was one of the most hotly contested projects that came before the board while I was there. A lot of people from the neighborhood came out, testified on both sides of the project. A husband and wife testified on opposite sides. One favored the project and one was against it. And what the major concerns, which were fair, were over increased noise and parking being very tight there. And parking is something that comes up over and over again in variance requests, because that frequently in denser neighborhoods is a big challenge in our city. Can be hard to get a street parking spot, and neighbors care about that. People want to be able to park near their house, understandably so. And so that's the kind of thing that frequently comes up. And it was an issue for this property. To make a long story short, it ended up being approved. The board put some restrictions in related to noise. The board put some restrictions in related to parking, and that group had added some additional parking, which helped alleviate some of those concerns. But they did a very good job, a very detailed job explaining why the economics didn't make sense for that property, and in some ways it was easy because I could show it had been vacant for 30 years, and so that sort of shows that if it had a better use under the zoning code, somebody would have figured it out in the last 30 years. But they also came with some really helpful evidence. They'd gotten a projection for turning the property into residences and apartments, and they looked at they had projections on the cost of renovating this historic property, and then what they could sell units for, rent units for, and showed that really wasn't economically feasible. So that helped support their project, and eventually that variance was granted, and now you've got a very vibrant restaurant speakeasy in the city. And I think I saw a question pop up.
There is one. It says, how does the board assess the parking situation? If no neighbor voices concerns about parking, does the board assume there is ample parking?
So it depends a little bit. In commercial districts, there are some parking requirements. And so the board will look at what's in the zoning code in terms of what parking is required. Just off the top of my head, like daycares, for example, there's certain parking requirements often is required for daycares. With residential districts, it's frankly a little less exacting. I would say if nobody brings up parking as an issue, often that issue will kind of slide by and not become a big issue. But that said, the board is very familiar with the city, familiar with different areas in the city. As I mentioned, Brian Mitchell on the board handles traffic and parking issues for the Department of Public Works. And Tom Ford is often out in the neighborhoods on development projects, and so they're very familiar with the neighborhood. So it can happen where nobody would bring it up, but the board would know that parking is an issue in that area, and so they may ask about it. But there really isn't a fixed rule on that when it comes to the residential properties. It's really more of a kind of up to the board, and it can go to that kind of health and welfare factor, which is a little bit ambiguous, frankly, and gives discretion to the board. But I would say the biggest factor is really if neighbors raise the issue. If people come out and raise the issue and are complaining about the parking implications, then that's usually going to be one of the more significant issues handled at the hearing. If they don't, then it usually isn't as frequent, as important of a topic. All right, so moving along, we also have special exceptions which come before the board. And these are specific provisions. So in the zoning code, there's uses as a matter of right that you just, no matter what, if that's the use you want to use in that zoning code area, it's approved. And then there's what are called special exceptions, which basically there's a list of other uses that are permitted in that area, but which require approval by the ZBA. And to meet those special exceptions, you've got to be able to show harmony with the general purpose and intent of the zoning regulations and maps. And you need to show that this use will not tend to affect adversely the use of neighboring property. So again, here it's kind of, does this fit in with the neighborhood? And is it going to have a negative impact on the adjoining properties? If not, then this will typically be approved. And if you look at the zoning code, each district has a section. The first section is uses as a matter of right, and then the next one is special exceptions. And so you can just see what that list is for other uses that are potentially approved. And this is obviously a much lower standard than a use variance. So it's much easier to get a special exception. I know we don't have a ton of time, so let me move along here. And I'm not going to cover this in a great deal of detail, but I did want to touch briefly on reestablishing a non-conforming use. So as I mentioned, most of the structures in the city of Wilmington predate the zoning code. And so you have houses that before the zoning code was implemented were cut up into, duplexes, triplexes, cut up into apartments. You've got, corner stores, commercial uses of property in residential districts, but it's been there for a long time. And the general rule on these types of uses is if the use was in effect, either when the zoning code went into effect or when a change occurred in the zoning code that no longer allows that use, you don't lose your ability to use the property in that way. So if you own a corner store and the zoning code used to say that you could have a corner store there, and now there's some changes to the zoning code, and now it says you can't have it anymore, well, you don't have to shut down your store. That would be, well, long story short, there's legal problems with that, with the government sort of infringing on your ability to use the property in the way that it's been used if it was previously a legal way to use the property. And so you get grandfathered in. It's called a non-conforming use. But what happens is if you don't use the property for that in that way for more than a year, you lose the non-conforming use. You lose the grandfathering into the property. And getting it back is a challenge. The sort of easiest way to get it back is to be able to show that you didn't intend to lose the non-conforming use and that the discontinuance was beyond your control. There's a presumption that if a property is not used in that way for a year, the property owner intended to discontinue use. Sometimes construction projects take a long time. So, I've seen where, permits were pulled and projects took a while and a property lost its non-conforming use, but was able to, with the board's approval, regain it because they could show that they did not intend to discontinue the use because they've been, working at remodeling the property. This, frankly, when it comes to duplexes, triplexes, apartments in single-family residences, there's additional code provisions that come into play, and it gets really complex. And we could do a 2-hour session on that. So just basically flagging this for you, especially if you're thinking about buying a property, you want to look at whether a property has lost its non-conforming use, if that's how you wanted to use it, or if it might be losing it soon, before you can get in there. So that's something to look at. closing in on a couple of things to focus on in terms of presentation, in terms of making your presentation to the board and getting ready for it. I know Deanna's told me that Jumpstart talks a lot about this for a whole variety of reasons, and neighborhood engagement is absolutely important for ZBA applications. Legally, it's not the most important factor, but the board is made up of humans, and if you have support from the neighbors, it's a lot easier to approve something, and if there's opposition from the neighbors, it's a lot harder to approve it. So neighborhood engagement is very important, and that can be done a few different ways. The property owners, adjoining property owners are really important, especially for those area variances, for the decks, things like that. If the property owner on the side where you're violating the setback, is good with the project, then you've got a very good chance of it being approved, because there's unlikely to be, opposition beyond that one neighbor who's affected. For use variances, for special exceptions, those obviously are still important to the neighboring property, but often it's important to people beyond that. And so neighborhood associations sometimes get more interest in that, and it can be a good idea to meet with the neighborhood association leadership and maybe present your project to the neighborhood association. The more in advance you can do this type of thing before a hearing, the better. It gives you a chance to hear any opposition. Sometimes people go to the neighborhood association and they say, here's what I want to do, and they get some objections, and they say, okay, you know what, let me take a look at this again and come back and meet with you again. And they're able to make some changes to their plan in a way that appeases the neighborhood and gets the neighborhood on board, and then really makes it easier for them to get the approval. And so then moving on to the board presentation, just a few suggestions. Watch a hearing in advance. I actually just got an email right before this that the public meetings are going to be changing or potentially changing with the city. Right now, the zoning board for the last year and 4 months has been meeting through Zoom. And so it was really easy to attend a meeting. You could just get the link and watch it. I don't know how the board will meet going forward. There are some different options. They could go back to only in person or kind of a hybrid where they have Zoom. But either way, whether you go in person to a meeting or are able to watch it on Zoom, I would watch a hearing or two in advance to get a flavor of how things operate. I'd think about who's going to present. Are you the developer, the property owner? Are you going to present? Are you going to be working with a real estate agent or an architect and you want them involved in the presentation? Do you have something that's maybe a little more controversial, a little more complex, and you want to hire a lawyer? So you want to think about that. Practice and preparation. So a quote that I like is, prior preparation prevents poor performance. And so if you're going to be presenting, you want to practice your presentation. You want to, maybe get your spouse or your kid, try to get them to sit through and let you run through it, or get a friend who isn't familiar with the project and, practice going over things and see what questions come to their mind, see if your presentation is clear. You also want to think about witnesses. Do you want a real estate agent to offer some testimony and support feasibility issues? Do you need an architect to explain something? Do you want to just frankly kind of pad the public comment? Do you have some people in the neighborhood that support the project? Can you get them to attend the hearing and say that they'll present during public comment and offer their support for the project? Again, if you can get public support behind your project, it will increase the likelihood that, it will increase the likelihood that your project's approved. And so, people don't often want to come out But if you can get your neighbor to come out and support it, or you can actually, usually the board will accept a written statement. So, if your neighbor's, kids got something going on and they can't come to the meeting, and you bring a statement from the neighbor, the board will usually consider that, and that can be helpful. And then also think about visual aids. There's usually, some requirement that the materials given to the board are, have survey plans or building plans that they can sit through or look through. But think about whether there might be some visual aids that are helpful. I'm thinking of some bigger projects where there might be, renderings of this really, cool project. It can be helpful to have those pictures available, and up for the board to see what, if they approve this, what great thing can happen. So those are just some things to think about when you are getting ready to present to the board. And I think we've got a few minutes here for questions. So if anybody has questions, let's get them now. And I don't know if Allie, there's any that came in that I missed.
There isn't any in the chat yet, but if anybody has any questions and they don't want to unmute, feel free to type them in and I will ask them for you.
Hi, this is
Yeah,
thank you for the presentation. I do have a question. When does the Department of Transportation and DelDOT, when do they become involved? So say, for instance, if you have a project in downtown Wilmington, and apparently there's an adjoining highway or etc., when do they become involved?
So the short answer to your question is I don't really know, because it's sort of beyond what the zoning board deals with. But certainly you're right that that those issues can come up. And frankly, in Wilmington, some streets are state streets and some are city, and so it can be the Department of Public Works for the city, or it can be DelDOT that you end up needing to work with. And probably your best resource there is when you're working with license and inspections. If there's going to be an issue, they can help flag that for you, or you can ask them about that.
So you would suggest meeting with them first, just to make sure that's separated before presenting it to the variance board?
Well, typically those issues don't really overlap. I know I mentioned parking can be an issue, but there aren't usually a lot of traffic flow issues with variances. I'm trying to think. The only time I even remember it kind of being an issue was with a daycare looking at drop off, and that really wasn't. That was just more sort of how it would affect the neighborhood rather than DelDOT or the Department of Transportation having a position that overlapped with the board. So it can be an issue, and just in general, you want to try to make sure you've got all the approvals that you need, as early in the process as possible. But typically that traffic issues don't overlap with zoning board issues.
Okay, thank you.
Hi, William. Thank you for presenting. It was very insightful and informative. I have a question in regards to the zoning of, again, let's say, well, we know the projects that are going to be coming through the riverfront and possibly further down around Riverside. And I don't know whether whether the decision has been made that what would be, I guess, an intermix of commercial and residential properties would be subjected to eminent domain in the case that some of those areas that they are, or would used to be residential, and maybe the owners of the properties want to keep it residential, but it's now turning into a commercial property, whether those people who own those residents or the land will be forced to sell it? And what would that look like?
Yeah, so that definitely kind of goes beyond beyond zoning board. So let me just
Okay.
kind of give you a couple general thoughts. One is it's going to be the zoning code's going to apply in terms of what uses are allowed, and in a lot of areas, mixed use is permitted. Some residential and some commercial. And that's, not really a bad thing necessarily. It's nice to have certain types of commercial uses nearby where you live. And so, but in terms of, pushing people out, that's kind of I think a different issue. Generally, redevelopment projects, eminent domain, I guess I would just say eminent domain has kind of a real limited purpose. What happens more often in the city is that people will kind of sit on properties and wait to be bought out in a private transaction. That happens far more often than eminent domain happens. Eminent domain is usually like the government coming in and taking a property, or taking is the wrong word, but purchasing a property through the eminent domain process. But what happens way more often in Wilmington is that a developer will come in and just purchase a property from the private owner, and sometimes there's that can. If you're the last one standing, sometimes you get a little more value for your property, but usually in those settings, it's a private transaction, and so people have a say in how much they get for the property.
Thank you.
Okay, well, I'll give it another minute if there's any other questions, and I'll just say that. Again, I think this program is wonderful. I'm really excited that Cinnaire is doing it, and if I can be, helpful on your projects, I'm happy to try to help. There's some limits on what I can do, if I'm not your lawyer, but if you ever want to reach out about something, you can email me at wlarson, WLARSON, at mgmlaw.com. And my office line is 302-504-6804. Also, if you just Google Bill Larson, Delaware lawyer, my firm profile will pop up, and I'm happy to talk with people.
Thank you, Bill. And we will be circulating a follow-up thank you email to all of our attendees with a link to the recording, the presentation, and we'll also include your contact information. Is there one last question for Bill? Okay, well, thank you, everyone. Thank you so much, Bill, for sharing great information. There's a lot of components to the development process. So having people be able to share their expertise and sort of some do's and don'ts and how to be successful is always greatly appreciated. And it's even more appreciated when they leave us with their contact information for us to follow up, because after we process this information, we may have some additional questions. So I'm going to turn it over to my colleague, Tamira Rayford, to close us out. Tamira.
Thank you, Deanna, and thank you, Bill. That was great. That was a great presentation. Just a couple of things before we end today's session. Please complete the brief survey that you will receive following this session. We would love to receive your feedback about this event, as well as any other topics that you would like to see in the future. And please stay tuned for more information about our next Kickstart session. It will be coming soon, so please stay tuned. So thank you, everyone, for joining us this evening, and have a great one.
Thank you.
Thank you.